So I'm working with technology because unfortunately I too had some downed trees and could not get out yesterday with the power outages here in New Jersey, but I'm very honored to be here and have the privilege of also working with David over the course of the last few years with my work at PwC. And so thank you for allowing me to be here with you. A little bit of background about me. When I heard some of the stories yesterday, I was born and raised in Staten Island, New York, of immigrant parents from the island of St. Martin. St. Martin's been in the news of late because they were one of the islands decimated with the most recent string of hurricanes this year, one of which made David not able to participate in one of the programs that we offered in September. But that island took a large hit. And the reason I mention that as far as my background is because St. Martin is an island that's both French and Dutch. And my parents are fluent and speak French and decided when they emigrated to the United States that they would choose not to speak French at home because in 1969, when they came to this country, they knew we would have such a hurdle just with race. And so when they had myself and my sister, they decided we would only speak English at home because we just didn't need one more thing. So Staten Island is a mostly white location, and going to mostly predominantly white schools, that was how I was introduced to race at a very young age. And if you think about it, when you fast forward and go into the corporate world, it was always something that we were cautioned not to talk about. You don't talk about race. You don't see color. And I will tell you, in all of my life, my 40 plus years on this earth, I will tell you that for most of the environments that I've been in, it's not something that you could sort of not talk to or speak to. There are other attributes to me, other dimensions of diversity, but that is one that I take into every room that I'm in. And in my work at PwC, it's something that I've always tried to bring to the discussion. And so it's funny that 19 years ago I began here, but even in this role that I'm in today, it sort of worked its way in, and now I do this full time for the organization. What I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about, let's see if my slides will work with me. As far as my agenda, I wanted to tell you a little bit about why we're talking about race. How do we have these productive conversations, or at least how we are trying to do better and improve that? And what does unconscious bias education have to do with it all? We heard Ron and others yesterday talk about that, and so I want to spend a little bit of time giving you some examples of some recent work that we're doing. And then more broadly, how is PwC trying to engage other organizations and institutions in thinking about this on a broader scale so that we can all collectively get better at this? Because race is definitely the thing that is probably the hardest when we think about any dimension of diversity to work through in an organization. And in some of the examples I give you throughout the presentation, you'll get a better sense of why. So what I wanted to share first was, as far as our approach at PwC, our strategy is to truly think about how do we engage in building an inclusive environment. So at the core of it, we talk about cultural dexterity. How do we make everyone feel included and that they have the ability to reach their highest potential with the organization? Our approach to doing that is how do we not only engage and focus and create certain programs and initiatives for certain groups, but also think about how do we engage the broader majority. So it's not just engaging the minority, but it is also about engaging the majority. And so when we talk about gender, for example, we want to make sure that we're including men. When we're talking about race, we want to make sure that we're including all races. When we think about, LGBT, we want to make sure we're including allies. And from a disability perspective, the same, those that with the potential disability. The way that we go about it is we create certain programs and initiatives, and then we think about what sources from a recruiting perspective, how are we onboarding our individuals, how do we require people to show and model the behaviors that we're looking to have happen throughout the organization. We want to make sure that we have the most objective criteria when we're thinking about individuals sourcing for a job, when we think about individuals transitioning to new roles, when we think about individuals getting promoted or, obtaining a leadership role. And then how do we also make sure along the way we're educating each other about our potential blind spots and unconscious bias? One of the ways that David and I met is because we have a program for our senior associates. Those are individuals within the organization that are with us probably from 4 years to 5 and 6 years. And that is what we call a senior associate in a professional services firm. And those individuals are hopefully playing to win and become managers. We want that group to be as diverse as possible and replicate what the world looks like. And that program, we know that race matters. And so a big part of the curriculum is David coming and talking about the HBR piece and why that work is still so relevant and important. So we talk and focus on why race matters and have a really intimate discussion with the group. That's just one example. We have other programs that are targeted and specific that we feel, based on the various points in someone's trajectory, that we have to intervene. Another program is for our Black African American new hires, where we focus on their onboarding to the organization. If you think about the accounting profession, it's less than 4% Black. And one of the things that we realize is that it takes such effort. When Melissa was talking yesterday about the percentage of schools, HBCUs, being 3%, when we think about just broadly how many of them are thinking about accounting as a major, it's not the most attractive major in the world. There's a lot of credentialing that comes along with becoming a CPA. And we know that getting through college, choosing accounting as a major, getting through all of those 5+ years to sit for the exam with the 150 credit hours, we know that there's challenges along the way. So when we get someone that has those credentials in the firm, we want to make sure that we're over-determining their success. So those are just some examples of the things that we're working on from a strategic standpoint. I talked a little bit about our approach as far as engaging the majority and the majority. Tim Ryan became our chairman in July of 2016. He was an audit partner. I had the privilege and honor of working with him when he led the assurance practice. And literally 4 days into his chairmanship, quite a few police shootings and other events happened that very first week of July. And Tim decided to get us together and ask a few questions about sending out a note to the firm. And the response that he got from that was tremendous. He got probably in his inbox the first hour of the email over 200 responses from individuals within the organization, thanking him for acknowledging what was happening that very first week in July. And what I will tell you is we decided to get individuals in the room, and what resonated the most was, for Tim, is that we couldn't just have the conversation with our Black professionals that were feeling something at the time. Tim also wanted everybody to hear the experiences because everybody had a point of view of what was happening. So we decided as an organization to engage in these discussions around race. We didn't just do this out of the blue. I will tell you that this was a foundation for the firm. We started down this journey probably the year before with Melody Hobson. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with Melody, but she is from Ariel Investments, and she had a TED Talk that was titled Being Color Brave or Colorblind. And when you think about it, the story that I gave to you before and how many of us have been socialized and grown up to think that you cannot talk about race, that this is truly a shift, and how do we bring color and race into the discussion in the corporate world? I will tell you today, in 2018, that is still probably the one that most organizations want to stay the furthest away from. And so these conversations were very facilitated when we brought Melody to speak the year before. And what Tim wanted to do was, how do we have colleagues that spend so much time together, engaging with each other? I mean, we work more than 8 to 10 hours a day. So where you're spending the majority of your time, how do you get people to really engage in a discussion around how they were feeling? And so it wasn't about taking sides. We gave some very specific guidelines and rules for people to follow and being very respectful. We use the Quaker model. You spend more time listening, less time speaking. So when you have the floor, you obviously share your experience. But the other large majority of time, you're actually listening to others and what they were experiencing. We thought that helped create a framework for people to have discussions. This next slide just shows the ground rules that we did. It was about being respectful, sharing, and listening. We asked people not to take sides or debate or try to convince people or brainstorm. The other don't discuss politics, and I will tell you that I took it off the side intentionally because if you fast forward, these same kinds of conversations happened in our country, and I'm not talking politics with you today, but once the election happened and Trump took office, many of our folks are feeling something. And so we felt that we had sort of a framework for people to engage in additional conversations. And still today, when you think about things like Charlottesville and others, it's about caring for the folks that you work with. You spend 90% of your time. And what our hope is that you weren't going to leave that at the front door and not talk about it, because we spend a significant amount of time, and you can't say that that doesn't seep into the walls of PwC. I could remember being at the firm when President Obama was inaugurated or elected, I should say. And the feeling that I had as a Black woman in a predominantly white floor, that I went the entire day at PwC and not one person talked about the election. And so a very different time with this go round when Trump was elected, and the conversations, at least people were willing to engage in a conversation on how I might have felt. And that was sort of just the journey that we've been on as an organization, a testament to the environment and culture we're trying to create where people feel comfortable talking about it. I did talk about Melody. This is one of her quotes as far as let's talk about it. She doesn't feel that because she's in her role that she's not part of the journey. If you haven't had the opportunity to engage or look at her TED Talk, I would strongly encourage you to view it. It's not that long, and it is very captivating. I made it a mission to try to find her and went to every event that she did to see how I could potentially get the opportunity to ask her to come to the firm and talk with us. I decided to share with you a little bit of our ad campaign to give you a flavor of how does this show up at work. It was on the cover slide of this slide presentation, but it is about real people and their experiences and what people perceive when they see faces. And so Sammy Miller is a recent partner at the firm. He's a working dad, talks about his sector, football fanatic, and talent scout. He helps us a lot with recruiting. He's focused on some of our HBCU recruiting. And the reason I share that is because most people don't know that Sammy's of African-American descent. And so he's motivated in other ways, and I think we automatically have our own assumptions when we see photos. And what we're hoping is that people will see parts of their story in his story. And so that was a very intentional approach for us in a most recent ad campaign that we created at the firm. I also want to talk a little bit around what Ron spent a little bit of time talking about yesterday around unconscious bias education. We've had the privilege and honor of working with Dr. Mahzarin Banaji at the firm for the last 9 years. And what she's talked and helped us with is how do we make sure that all of us are becoming more aware of our potential blind spots, because they help us make better decisions. And no one is saying that once you complete an unconscious bias training with Dr. Banaji, you've arrived. That's not our intent. What we are hoping is that people become more aware of their potential blind spots so that in the next decision that they make, that they are much more intentional and aware that they have a broader set of choices. And so what I want to play for you is some of the most recent work that we've been partnering with her on, and that is sort of building on the ad campaign that we described. So hopefully technology works, but Serenity, who's been a joy to work with, and I forgot to mention her in the beginning, thank you for all of your help, and let's hope the video plays. So I'm going to shut up for a second and let you view one of the podcasts that we've created with Mazarine.
Psychologist Alexander Todorov has discovered the mathematics underlying our first impressions. Using data he's collected from thousands of people at Princeton University, Dr. Todorov has built a computer program that can pinpoint the very parts of a face that trigger our gut instincts. That is, whether someone looks aggressive, introverted, attractive, and so on. See for yourself. As quickly as you can, answer this question. Which of these two people is more trustworthy, A or B? And what about from this pair? And this one? This probably wasn't hard, and in fact, you could have done it even faster. Here's Dr. Todorov.
You don't need more than 160 to 100 milliseconds to get pretty much the same first impression you will get from unlimited time.
This was Dr. Todorov's first finding, that first impressions are fast. The second finding is perhaps even more surprising. Almost everyone sees the same thing. Consider the faces you just saw. If you're like the majority of people in Dr. Todorov's studies, these are the ones you chose as being more trustworthy. And what about competence? Just look at this face created by Dr. Todorov's software. The changes to this face are small. The tilt of the mouth, the size of the brow, the distance between the eyes. And yet, taken together, these features trigger a judgment. If we're honest, we'll admit that this face seems to be gaining and losing IQ points right in front of our very eyes. We're all familiar with sayings like, don't judge a book by its cover. But we do. And Dr. Todorov's studies show this too.
We did some studies presenting participants' faces of politicians, and it turns out that using judgments of naive participants, we can predict about 70% of the electoral outcomes. In a nutshell, politicians who happened to look more competent than their rivals were more likely to win in the elections.
These findings, which included almost every major congressional candidate for the 2004 to 2008 elections, are incredible. Campaign promises, advertisements, and experience aside, what really matters is how you look. And faces don't just sway who we elect to lead our governments. They also affect who we hire, who we give opportunities to, who we promote. Now, if everyone sees the same thing when they look at a face, it raises the question, are these impressions accurate? Do people look more competent because they actually are more competent? Do they look more trustworthy because they are more trustworthy? The short answer is no.
Often the natural assumption is there must be some kernel of truth in these impressions. But if you look closely at the data, there's very, very little evidence that these judgments are accurate. In many situations, you can ignore completely the face and your judgment will be much better.
If faces are so misleading, the question then, of course, is why? Why do our brains do this? Here's a popular theory for the case of trustworthiness. We look more trustworthy the more we look like babies. Large eyes, small chins, round faces, these are the features we love about infants, the most trustworthy creatures there are. So when adults possess these features, we view them as more trustworthy, kind, and honest. Research tells us we're more likely to agree with baby-faced adults, to accept their offers in negotiations. We're even less likely to convict baby-faced defendants for premeditated crimes, and more likely to give them more lenient sentences when we do. And what does this mean for the workplace? Are baby-faced employees more likely to get the benefit of the doubt in a workplace dispute? Does the width of your jaw influence your hireability? Clearly, our first impressions can get us into trouble. So let's talk about how to get around them and make better decisions. It's hard. First impressions are fast and they're automatic. But if we can admit that these judgments happen, we can find simple ways to outsmart our minds. How many times have you said or heard something like this?
I felt like I could trust her as soon as I met her.
Or,
I can really see him in this role.
when you catch these moments, ask a simple question. Based on what? Want something stronger? Here's one senior leader in education's strategy. As soon as I meet someone, I acknowledge my first impression in the first 5 seconds and spend the rest of the interview trying to prove myself wrong. Be your own devil's advocate by challenging your first impressions. Finally, when applicable, try putting off the face-to-face early on in the hiring process. Focus on hard evidence of skill, talent, and experience that's in a resume or other objective forms of data as a first step. We can all be blinded by first impressions, but with regular practice, we can learn to look past the surface.
The reason why we created these smaller bite-sized pieces around unconscious bias, because we felt that they were more of a reminder and booster. If you think about the training, we brought Maserati in to do 3-hour training. Many organizations today are not giving enough time for training, and so we wanted to create other assets that people could use and leverage, and not just within corporate in our environment, but broader on college campuses and much more broadly throughout the world. How do we all educate ourselves and remind ourselves how we could get better and more aware of our potential blind spots? So that's the work that we underwrote the cost for the research and efforts. And so there are probably about 6 or 7 assets out there on this Outsmarting Human Minds site that's open and available to the public. We think, just again, more of what Ron was saying yesterday, once people know that this is grounded in science, it makes them a little bit less defensive, that there's something wrong with them. We all have blind spots. We all have to be okay with that. And so this was our attempt to do that. At PwC, we make our blind spots training mandatory for anyone that is eligible for promotion. And so there's a lot of research out there too, whether or not mandatory training has any kind of effect. And so our belief is that we're using more of a carrot, that this is a leadership skill. If you want to be a leader in the organization, you need to arm yourself and be more mindful and strengthen this skill set around inclusive leadership. And so that's our attempt. Every one of our new hires are required to do it as well. Last year was the first year that we did this, and the deadline was April 30th for everyone to go ahead and do this training. 96% of our potential promotes that year actually completed the training by the date they needed to. So we think that that's a success. We have the same requirement in place for this April 30th and hope that we'll have sort of the same results. And to date, over 30,000 of our professionals, we're a 50,000 professional services firm, over 30,000 of our professionals have actually completed the training. So we think that that's a way to help us on our journey around unconscious bias education. My next slide talks a little bit about what we're doing as an organization that's broader than this, but all steering and stemming from our race discussions in July. So Tim Ryan, in his full year now, as chairman, has asked other organizations to think about what they're doing around bringing these conversations to work. And so he created this coalition, for lack of a better word, of other CEOs as a steering committee. And on that steering committee, they were also our competitors. If you think about the big 4 firms, we don't do a lot together, but this is an issue that's bigger than us. And how do we tackle unconscious bias, diversity and inclusion? And so they all committed to signing this pledge. There are 3 tenets of the pledge. In order to any signatory, and it has to be the CEO, not the HR leader, not the CDO, but there are 3 core commitments. And we want anyone to really continue these conversations like the ones that we've had around race. We want them to continue around their journey on unconscious bias education and to share best practices, both successful and unsuccessful. because there's a lot of money being spent within and resources trying to get better at these issues. And it is a broader commitment. To date, we have close to 400 organizations signed up. Colleges and universities are also signed up. So I am actually working to see if we can get Harvard and David, I'm coming your way with Morehouse as well. So just wanted to share with you a little bit about what we're doing from a PwC perspective, and we'll take questions at the end. But hopefully this was helpful just to share how we are trying to bring it home and embed it in the organization.